Hey everyone, it's Kate Stillman with the Yoga Health Coaching Podcast, and I'm here with Jaime Hogan from Australia, and she knows all about regenerative leadership, regenerative agriculture, regenerative design, regenerative building. And I'll have you do a little introduction of yourself. I just want to point people to your website first, which is placevillosophy.com.au. I know when I first met you, I was like, oh, this is good. This is good that you're in our yoga health coaching sphere, because we need more people like you that are bringing this side of the holistic equation into the conversation. So Jaime, tell everyone a little bit about yourself and what got you into the whole regenerative movement.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. So I started as an architecture student and was always obsessed with ecologically sustainable design. So how can our buildings work harder? So a lot of the time we actually design really dumb buildings and smart people, and we kind of need to be designing both, like smart buildings and smart people, where we're, encouraging people to actually be really actively engaged with the buildings that they live in and the environment that they live in. So that was always my driving force in architecture. I went on to practice for a few years actually. And I just kind of felt like the impact wasn't going to be big enough for me. So I wanted to do bigger things. So I moved into urban design and planning. But the whole way through the trajectory of my career thus far, I kept coming across like the way that all of these amazing people who are so passionate about creating change in the world, so architects, urban designers, planners, are like, if you could design a way for people to be like not creative and unhealthy, like that is the classic architecture studio. It's like, let's lock people behind a screen, with the same people like for 12 hours every day.
Let's take out any daylighting. Daylighting's a no. Yeah,
totally. And completely oblivious to what time of day or what season it is outside as well. Right. And like not spending time outdoors or in the city. And I then myself became like really burnt out and discovered yoga. And so then sort of threw myself into that world simultaneously. And what I found was like with the yoga community, these were the people who were actually living in the city, because they're the ones who are like trying to get around to all of their clients and studios everywhere. Whereas like the people who are designing the cities are in the same room every day.
They're not actually moving decisions around the city. Yeah.
I was like, wow, there's a real like disconnect here between the people who are making these decisions and the lives that they actually live. And so for me,
and their level of consciousness, because that's another really big factor, is like the environments that we put ourselves in affect our level of consciousness, unless we're at a level of consciousness that transcends that. But for a lot of people, if it's 40 hours a week, that's really hard to maintain.
Huge. Yeah. And also like you throw it into the culture of lots of drinking, late nights, and there's also this weird thing, I'm not sure if it's the same in the States, but it's definitely a thing in Australia, that like in a corporate setting, if you get up and you're the first one to leave, there's kind of this like, oh, you're not in it with the rest of us. So like if you're leaving at a reasonable hour, there's something wrong with you, and it kind of gets noted down against
you must not want that promotion, Bob.
Yeah. So it's super unhealthy, obviously. So place philosophy for me is kind of like the bringing together of these worlds of like, how can we bring like an actual understanding of well-being, consciousness, and creativity into fields that are actually meant to be focused on that? And how do we actually like bring integrity for those people, like sustainability consultants as well, I work with, because they're the same. They are promoting how we actually create more sustainable systems. They themselves are the most burnt out people. And it's like, how, that integrity between how we're actually being and what we're doing in the world was really big for me. So I thought there are so many amazing people who have these visions for like a better world, but we're not supporting them to actually be able to stay in those professions. So I've known so many architects, planners, urban designers, sustainability consultants that have dropped out of that profession because they're burnt out, and they go and do something like yoga teaching for a while and, try and find something else that has more meaning.
They like swing the pendulum way over to like more consciousness, more freedom, more movement. Yeah. More
Yeah.
integrity. But
Yeah.
then that probably doesn't work either because they're not using their skills. Yeah.
Exactly. And that, we mentioned briefly before, like that's the dharma that comes for me. Like, how are we actually helping those people to bring all of the parts of themselves to their work? And how do we redesign those workplaces so that they can do that? And so that they can, be like, they can be leaders in that sense of, I'm actually living the lifestyle that I think we all should be living, which is healthy and creative and in tune with the seasons and the rhythms of nature, like, as well as doing my job that I love, which is helping to design a better world.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I'm thinking back to in 1996 when I was working on a Department of Energy contract under an environmental nonprofit in Washington, D.C. It was the International Institute for Energy Conservation. And my job was to get research from the United States into our satellite offices, which were dealing with like basically like the next exploding economies in Asia and in South America. And it was like Green Lights Project, Smart Buildings Project. Like we've known these things for so long. And, even like daylighting in big buildings, right? Just where, even like Walmart had a test project back in the 90s that measured employee happiness. They installed, I think it was like one daylit building, and they tested employee happiness in that building versus their other buildings. And it was like night and day, like just in terms of like depression, anxiety, anger issues, how long they stay in that same, working with the same company for, and it was just like, oh my gosh, how come we haven't seen this? How come we haven't seen this change? So I'm not going to have you answer that huge question right now, because I really do want to talk more about regenerative leadership, regenerative mindset, even for like just like the typical homeowner, or not even homeowner, but just like person dwelling in residence, and just some of the things that you think about that you think other people, their lives would benefit if they started thinking maybe a little more like you.
So I suppose one of my favorite ideas in the regenerative space is, particularly in the regenerative leadership space, is the idea of the death of the hero. And, coming into the age of like, actually everybody needs to be their own hero. And like, we need to rise up, bring like all, the rising tide lifts all boats kind of idea. Yeah. So, this is one of the things that I really love about like the yoga health coaching model, is that we're actually like being trained as leaders in our community to help lead people through the process of like, I know what I need to do, but I'm not doing it. Yeah. Like, how do I do that? And how do I be in a community that's actually oriented towards like growth? Or I was having a conversation yesterday where maybe we can move away from the word growth, because, in an economics term, that's not actually that good. So how can we move towards depth, or how can we move towards evolution, or whatever it is? But the idea, I think, is like, actually all of us, we recently had COP26, where the world's leaders got together and sat around and spoke about like whether or not we should try to save the planet. It's like, we're beyond that, like we're so far beyond that even needing to be a discussion anymore. What we need is like everybody, regenerative leadership. So like all of the people doing their part in their place.
Yeah.
And there's an idea in regenerative leadership as well that we can't save the world, but we can save our place.
And that's where the place philosophy comes in. Yeah. Great.
Yeah, it's like localization of your ecosystem. And you speak about this a lot as well, is like actually getting to know your particular patch, and like, who are the people there? Who are the traditional owners? Like, what's the traditional wisdom of that area? How can we re-empower that? And a lot of this comes back to like the 10 habits, are you actually living in rhythm with your place, not somebody else's place, and not a place that exists only in your mind, or like only in the, the created structures of today's world, but like, how do you actually tap yourself into your bioregion? So I suppose some of the things that like householders can do is like really just pay attention to like the rhythms of nature in your patch. And that might be different to like somebody else's patch. What are the local plants that are in your area, and how can you help to re-establish those communities of plants as well. You know, a big one is like getting into community agriculture, like look for farmers, or even better, if you can find somebody who's already set this up, somebody who's going around and like helping regenerative farmers. And regenerative farming is effectively taking the industrialized model and actually reversing that. So we're healing the earth by, you know, replenishing soil, getting diversity back into the ecosystem, you know, doing great things. So if you can purchase a weekly box from people who are making sure that they're buying from those farmers who are trying to heal the earth, that's going to make huge gains in your local area. And it's expensive up front, but you know, you talk about this all the time in like Body Thrive, is like, how much money are you actually saving at the end of the day?
Yeah.
From your healthcare costs.
Right. I mean, there's the healthcare costs, and the other thing is you say, like what I was thinking about when you were talking is there's this great organic, it's like a micro dairy, right, for our valley, and they produce really high quality milk and cream, and it's for anyone who's getting high quality fats, and whether you're eating animals or using animal products or, you know, more in the nuts and seeds, it's like fat goes a long way. And with the habit of intermittent fasting, what we find in Body Thrive is like our members save the course tuition in basically just food, beverage, self-care, healthcare, like those categories. They get more than the $5,000 return on investment. And that's our price for being in Body Thrive for a year. So they become educated in real time in how to better invest in themselves. And in the process, they save money and get smarter, and it opens up other opportunities, which can also be income generating in various ways, whether it's like someone's health, like we've seen this, someone's healthier and gets a raise. We've seen like someone gets healthier, leaves their pathological boss behind and gets a raise working for a healthier company. Like we've seen all this happen with like Body Thrive members. But one thing I wanted to mention is that the core concept that I'm hearing is, core concept I'm hearing with regeneration, right, is it's inherently tied to community. And in my research for Wild Habits, for writing that book, in the whole first part, I go through like what the potential is and what the problem is with chronic inflammation and the diseases, and then how do genetics work, and how do epigenetics work, and how does the microbiome work, and then what is regenerating and what is degenerating, and therefore what is medicine. And that's like the little first part of the book is like, let's just like a You Are Here map with like all the stuff that we might be reading in the news and some of the stuff we might be hearing in the health and fitness and nutrition side of things, as well as the, you know, and it's like, where does all this stuff fit into the picture? And where I've really landed after doing like just way too much research, but also not nearly enough because it's so fun and it's so deep, is that like you want to, like everyone's got to start thinking about like my immune system is my microbiome, and the healthier my microbiome is, the more integrated I am into my ecosystem, and the more I have. It's so fascinating, the research on viruses and bacteria, because like good microbiome needs good viruses, right? So there's like a total misunderstanding. Like a lot of people are walking around with like a 1960s understanding of bacteria, let alone like a 1900s understanding of viruses. And the more we understand the whole system, it's like this whole thing works together. Like I need the good viruses to actually keep the good viruses going, and the good viruses keep my immune system and digestive system in a place where I have higher cognitive function, which means I'm smarter, which means I'll make better choices, which means I'll have an intrinsic understanding of community from within myself. And then that'll actually make me a better member of community outside myself, because I simply won't be as pathological, whether mentally or physically. And that's kind of like the microcosm is the macrocosm, and the macrocosm is the microcosm, right? It's like down to the cellular level, we are designed for regenerative as a concept.
Absolutely. And it's the same principle really, is like, you know, if you're looking at a resilient landscape or, you know, working towards a regenerative landscape, it's like you want diversity. Is like number one. A diverse system is a healthy system, and that's exactly the same as your microbiome, like the inner and the outer world.
It's a genetically diverse microbiome that activates our own genes. So like
Yeah.
Do you know that whole stat on the modern human today has 30% less genetic diversity in their microbiome than a wild human? Like
Yeah,
that's considered,
crazy.
like we've lost a third.
It's mental. I mean, I would say that you kind of like you could probably make a similar assumption about the diversity and interest in like our building stock as well, because
Yeah, talk about
you know,
that.
so boring. Like the buildings we're building now are so boring. You know, they're just like copy paste, repeat. And I know like
And same thing with
sprawl
houses too, right? Like the typical
yeah,
like single family home.
exactly. Like that sprawl model of just like everybody needs their own 2 cars, their own 4 TVs, like the bloated houses. You know, the United States and Australia have the largest house square meter rate in the world. So it's just like we don't need all of that crap. And it's, you know, that's filler, you know, rather than like the substance of like living a happy life. You know, people spend more time in their cars driving to and from the place. Their house looks exactly the same as their neighbors. They kind of get this like blindness to diversity. And, you know, we haven't even looked at, or maybe there are studies. I don't think there's been anything recently published about this, like how the difference between an interesting designed environment and a boring designed environment, like what interest or what impact that actually has on your brain as like a human. Because we're so used to, if you think about being in nature, like there's so many different things that the eye needs to take in, and different lighting, different movement, colors, textures, etc. And now we're just designing these buildings that are like 50 stories high and they look exactly the same from top to bottom. And it looks the same in New York, in Shanghai, in Sydney, like all of the buildings look exactly the same. And so we're losing that like sense of cultural diversity. We're just having the one culture now that exists across the planet, which is like consume shiny buildings, eat all of the food that tastes exactly the same across the world, because we've managed to do that too somehow.
Right.
It's like just completely destroying diversity and creativity.
Yeah, it's like it's like the economies of scale, right? Around standardization and standardized processes are like creating vanilla, and vanilla is depressing and anxiety ridden.
But a good quality vanilla is still good, but like, you
Good
know.
quality Madagascar vanilla. We're not talking about that. We're talking about vanilla wafers. Oh my gosh. I want to be super selfish on this podcast. So we are under contract to buy these old buildings in Montana, in this old mining town that has like insane environmental issues, like world-class environmental issues from being the United States' largest copper mine for 100 years ago. But because of that, it drove in all this insane wealth. And so there's insane architecture, like art, like, and then a lot of these, and then that whole town went through a massive depression in the last 50 years. So a lot of these buildings are vacant, and now is a revitalization. And because of the depression, it's like some of the only really cool, affordable urban real estate in the Rocky Mountain West. So there's really interesting investors coming in. We sort of got in like right before like that next bubble started to rise. We haven't closed yet, but we're closing soon on this. And one of the buildings is the old Dodge Brothers showroom. It's a 4-story building. Each floor is about 4,000 square feet. And it's all concrete because they had cars in it. Like they figured out how to get cars on, like, so you'd go into the showroom and like go up the stairs, and there are 100 years ago, those like whatever it was, the Model T, not the Model T Fords, because it was Dodge, the Model D Dodges or whatever, right? And all that. And I go in there and it's like the daylighting is amazing. And what I think of right away, because I love small business. I really do. And I started off in nonprofits, and I made a huge shift because I thought I would have, like, if you had talked to me at 20, my idealistic self at 23 years old would have probably been in nonprofits for the rest of my life, like to change the world, save the planet kind of nonprofits. But the core of my being was like very connected to capitalism and to the value exchange of how you could create something or improve something and be rewarded really be rewarded from that on a like really personal level, and then have more capital to do more of that. And I found, I think a lot of people in the whatever, the social profit, nonprofit, whatever the heck you want to call it now, in that sector, get really frustrated with the bureaucratic infrastructure that, capitalism somewhat takes out of the game, where it's just like, no, you want to do it? Like, go find some money if you need the money to do it. Otherwise, put in your sweat equity and go do it. And so on one of these floors, like instantly what I wanted to do is create a kiosk oriented makerspace for people to sell product out of, like, where creating, it's almost like I think of the building as a diverse small business ecosystem, where the businesses in there attract each other, and they attract kind of like good bacteria, right? And it's like I'll use it. And I think it's really important that we have these kind of examples of like, this is how the body works. This is how nature works. So for example, right now there's a huge 1 to 2 gallons, this massive piece of glass I found at a garage sale. And I was like, I don't know what I'm going to use it for. Well, now it's my gut shot vase, where I like stew my gut shots, or like we ferment them. So I had like old gut shots, and then I add that to my husband's kimchi and cabbage and salt water and a little bit of sauerkraut from another batch. So I'm like taking already well-developed microbial ecosystems, adding salt water and fresh cabbage, which is like it's like a nitrate nitrogen cycle feeder product, right, into this, so that it could grow into the next batch. So then in 2 days, I'll have my kimchi gut shots, right? I'll have a gallon of kimchi gut shots, so I can give them to the neighbors and help everyone else's digestive system get strong. But I'll also have a starter for the next thing. It's kind of like sourdough starters. It's like when you have a developed community, it can regenerate other communities, and you can build on it. And that's really how I think of like the building in this space. And like, I know one of the big struggles for small business is overhead. So it's like, how do we use some level of automation in their sales process, some like more automation, so that they can run their little kiosks and have an economies of scale and have the insane diversity of their creativity under one roof, and encourage that kind of low overhead, make your stuff, let's make it easier to sell your stuff, and to have it be centered on like products that are great for lifestyle, products that make you healthier, products that are fun to have, share with your kid, like just that kind of way of thinking. And I find that like, why is that so out of the box? Like, why is that not being well demonstrated in any rockin' small town, where you have all these creative people who have different issues on economies of scale of like, how do they deal with, they can't have a salesperson full time, right? They can't deal with customers. So like, there's all these things that could be built into better, stronger, smarter ecosystems of business. And I think, what I've seen in towns that have really strong ecosystems of small business that have high levels of creativity, people will pay more to visit that place, right? It generates its own economy of outsiders wanting to come in and check it out and have cool experiences.
Totally. I think we kind of have a little bit of that in Australia, but it's not in a curated way like that builder. And that sounds like such an amazing project. Like, oh my gosh.
Good. I'll get your help. I'll get your help on that one, Jamie.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Like we have that, but it's in the areas where they're just before the wave of gentrification comes in. So it's like the people moved out of the city when the suburbs became cool, and those leftover older buildings, the warehouses, etc., got filled up with the creatives, the artists, those sort of the makers, as you call them, and like created, but like diverse communities within a community. So there would still be like the older residents who did stay, but then like a new wave of creativity and something came through. But it's not necessarily in like one building. It's kind of like on a dispersed but localized area. Yeah. And I think that like that's super, totally. And it's really, as you say, it's kind of like taking the culture that's already there, which is a really big idea in regenerative practice, is like start where you are and notice what's unique and specific about your place or about the community or about your body, and go like, okay, what if we add this? what does that do to the system? And what if we add that? What does that do to the system? And so it's kind of like taking these little experiments and playing and noticing like what makes the system smarter and more creative itself, so that we could kind of step away. Like you don't need, you know, what they don't want in that place in Montana is for Kate Stillman to need to be there all the time.
Right.
Like you kind of want to set up the intelligence of the system that then self-perpetuates and continues to be creative and evolve, so that you could, if you needed to, step out and the system has the intelligence itself.
Well, and that's exactly how we'll build it, is that way. Is it's like, we do that in yoga health coaching. I mean, we do that in Yoga Healer too, with our Past Leadership program. It's like, some people want to stick around. They've already been through enough training with us, and they want to stick around and give, and they want to get better at leadership. And so we developed Past Leadership so that it's around that concept. Peter Block does a great job in his book Community, which I think he wrote in 2009. It's an older book, but it's so phenomenal, describing leadership in companies and organizations, and around these regenerative principles. And like the idea of the leader, like the leader grows the structure for the evolution of the community. And that whole like, you know, that whole structure is going to precede the evolution, right? Like structure precedes evolution, which is, I think that's Mastering Leadership, Anderson and Adams. Like that whole concept of like, oh, to lead doesn't mean I'm the star. To lead doesn't mean I need to be the center of attention or the center of how other people connect and communicate. The leader needs to take themselves out so that the structure, so they can focus on the structure. Like it's like when you're growing a plant, right? And it's a climber. Like you got to give it something to climb up. It wants to climb. You got to help it just put the structure in front of it, and then it can climb up. And that's what we keep finding now that we're like 10 years into our Past Leadership program at Yoga Healers. Like I get on my forums, our forums of our course members, and I just see this insane amount of creativity and guidance and care and support for the new members coming in from the leadership. And it's not me, right? It's not me in there creating posts and that kind of thing. Like it's not me in there doing unless I'm like, oh my gosh, you guys, you need to know this, you know, but like, it's the Past Leadership program, right? It's like, that's empowering the new members, and then the members will eventually be in that program for, you know, for the ones that it's resonant for.
Yeah, it's I love what you just said with the plants and needing that extra bit of structure, because there's a phrase, I can't remember who said it, it's a while ago now, but effectively in regenerative practice, what you're doing is designing the conditions for life. And so in the same way that you need to be, if you have a pot plant, that plant is like dependent on you to make sure that it gets the water that it needs and it gets the light that it needs and the nutrients and things. So you're needing to create, you know, I need to be aware of that pot plant sitting on, you know, the sill so that it gets the right lighting, and I remember to water it, et cetera, et cetera. And then it will be able to grow. But at no point are you doing the growing for the plant. And at no point are you forcing the plant to grow, because you literally can't do that. You're in relationship with the plant and you're creating the conditions for the plant to grow. And so that's exactly like what the structure for Paths to Leadership is doing, is like, it's creating the conditions where like people go, oh my gosh, here's what I love to talk about. Can I go into the forum and talk about that? Or can I share my experience? And so it becomes like, it's really taking the essence of each individual and letting them shine. So the job of the leader is to, be able to design the structure and then walk away. Yeah.
Yeah. It's so true. Like one of the things that we found with the yoga health coaches is they needed, not everyone, but like it was at least half just simply needed more experience. They just needed more experience and time that was, you know, that would go into like marketing and sales for them to be able to coach people, right? It would be like, they'd have to do all these things in order to have a certain amount of experience. And we're just like, we can give you 6 people to guide through the Q1 of Body Thrive. Right. And it was just like, we know how to give you experience. And it took a need from us of like me needing to be that person or someone else more in us hiring team for that. And it enabled our health coaches to get to the kind of experiences they needed in the easiest possible way that grows the entire community. So it's not just growing the yoga health coach. It's not just growing the new Body Thrive member, right? And that took time. It took time to look at like, where are their bottlenecks, right? Like, where are things not happening, and what kind of training do the mentors need, and what kind of, like, how do we set up the structure in the contract so that so that we can really walk away at a certain point. And that's sort of like tinkering that nature does. It's like the microbiome's constantly tinkering with itself, like the way I look at it, right? We need more nitrous oxide.
And like the ability for people also to, what I love so much about this community is like that there's a place to go if you don't have that culture in your own life, so that you can like literally almost transplant yourself into somebody else's culture for a moment. And it's almost like, you know, we do this with like cultured transplants, you know, fecal transplants and microbiome transplants. It's like, oh, you're really lacking this culture in your ecosystem, like your relationships.
It reminds me of like why like old Chinese men would drink 10-year-old boy pee. Wanted the microbiome. Right? It's like transplant. And it comes in all these ways, right? Of like, if you can't generate it, if you're not regenerative in yourself. Yeah. Okay. Keep going.
Yeah. And then also like when you transplant like somebody else into that culture, and then rather than them needing to push it on their spouse or their, you know, the people that they live with, like, hey, we should all be doing this. They just live it because they can already be in the culture somewhere else. But then that, of course, is inspiring for other people. They see that and they go, wow, they've changed. Like, I want some of that. What are they doing? Oh, they took some of that culture. Can we have some of that over here? And so it kind of becomes a self-perpetuating, like the life of the culture becomes a thing of its own, and it wants to find other places to grow, but in the way that's unique for that place too.
Yeah. And I love that you keep coming back to that. Like there's an inherent difference. There's an inherent creative potential that's locational. That's really at that particular place that can happen there. And like, that's how nature works, right? It's like when I mean, even in this valley that I live in, like there's a lot of different ecosystems in this one valley. And then how do humans play with their own little patch, like you keep saying, like, and a patch could be a kitchen with a bunch of fermenting foods in it, right? And some plants in it and some basil growing on the windowsill. Like it doesn't have to be like the full blown, if you don't have a place to compost, if you don't have a place to grow things, right? That like it's full cycle, then like you start with what it is, but then it starts to expand out of there. It's so funny. So my compost bin has a hole in it. And so the neighborhood, like my dog sometimes protects it from the other neighborhood dogs, but like, we don't fix it on purpose, right? Like we don't fix it on purpose. And it was interesting. There's the wheat belly guy, the wheat belly doctor, I can't remember his name. He did this great video on how dogs have a bacteria that it's something like, oh my gosh, I think it's like 1 in 20 humans currently have. And like those humans are living in really pristine ecosystems in like Tibet and in like the really high mountains in Peru and Bolivia and whatnot. And it's bacteria that generates oxytocin in massive quantities. And for those who don't know oxytocin, it's the pro-social hormone. It's the connection hormone. It's obviously the hormone that bonds the mother to the baby, but it's so much more than that. It's like people that have high levels of this bacteria that produces oxytocin, or of really healthy levels of oxytocin, are pro-social, meaning they're regenerative in community. They're functioning like a piece of an ecosystem rather than a separate isolated self. So if our oxytocin levels are low, right, and our cortisol levels are high, we've actually taken ourselves out of regenerative culture, a regenerative human culture. So back to the dog, right? Like I know my dog's microbiome is healthier than mine. If my dog needs nutrition out of the compost, I'm guessing that's intelligent. Because I know her body's more smart than mine. Like you leave the two of us in the woods for long enough, like I know who's going to survive. right? Like she has a coat that can make it through the winter, right? And things like that. And her sense of direction and sense of smell. And like, she knows where all the different plants are, and she's never been on conventional food. So her palate is very much the palate of both the ecosystem and the food that I make for her, and the random stuff that's in the compost. And like, to me, this is how regenerative thinking works, where we're not trying to keep everything so neat and contained that, like, if the animal's eating it out of the compost, okay, so then the cat, let's get to the cat. The cat starts wanting to eat the homemade dog food I make for the dog. And like the cat had homemade cat food for a while, and then like that fell away, and he was eating conventional cat food. And at one point he's like, no, I want the dog food, right? And my animals eat so many plants around the property, like, and it's really fun to see what they're eating, and like, what do you guys have that I haven't been eating? Because, you know, a lot of people wonder, like, where did humans learn how to eat wild plants? Like, what point did they know what was good for what? And like, a lot of the ancient herbologists are just like, or herbologists that study have more of like a longer term perspective, is like, well, they basically, if they had any question, they just watch the animals and see what the animals were using it for, right? And it's like, oh, right, we're all learning from each other all the time. And as soon as we get out of the consumer model and we get into a regenerative model, there's this just like, oh wait, what is everybody eating? What does everybody need next?
I love that. Like, the idea of long-term thinking is so foreign to us, but like, you know, we want to know now. Like, if I went outside, how would I know? Like, looking at the plants, and it's like, that takes time. You're relearning something that our culture did away with hundreds of years ago. Like,
Yeah,
it takes time, but it's important that we invest that time now. You know, in the same way that like investing in your local food co-op is an investment in the future that you want to have. It's like investing the time now to like go and find a group of like somebody who can walk you around your neighborhood and show you the plants, or like buy a book and watch and test and see what happens. Like, slow experimentation over time for that like long-term vision is really where it's at. It's like, let's get away from like, we want the thing to happen now. Like, that's how things happen organically over time.
Yeah, and like anyone anyone who has a compost bin, or anyone who's fermented food, or right, it's like there's a time function where it's that whole asynchronistic is how I describe it. It's like there's little things that you do in food sadhana, like where it's like your food is as your spiritual practice. There's like things that you do, and it might take 10 minutes to do that thing, and then time needs to happen. In that time, if it's compost, it might need to happen for 6 months, right? If it's gut shots on your counter, it might need to happen for 3 days, but something needs to happen with like exactly what you're saying without you there. And you just set up the structure. And, you know, just back to yoga health coaching, I feel like so much of that has happened over time with the infrastructure that we train the yoga health coaches in, especially with generating a mentor community around their annual pass. For those who are more advanced and want to really develop community, you know, at another level where there's like really good regenerative infrastructure within the community, is like you set up these things. Like once we set up that contract in passive leadership, it's like everybody in the community gets so much back from that. And that happens over time. And even the annual pass, like I've been grilled on this so much over the years of like, it's too long, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, people need time. Like if you want a plant to grow, right? Like it needs time. It needs to go through cycles. It needs to go through seasons, right? Like, and humans are not different than that. You know, and I'm just glad that you're highlighting that part as well.
Totally. It's like, what kind of, I think we just need to get our heads out of the consumerist capitalist model, which is like, in this financial year, what like gains did you make? And it's like, that's what's led us into this climate change mess, is that short-termist thinking, and it's not going to get us out. We need to be like, you know, what kind of like environment do I want to create for my kids, or what kind of environment do I want to create for 7 generations from now is a big thing. There's a, you know, that's a really big idea. I interviewed
that guy because he then went on to make Hello products, but he was one of the founders. I can't remember his name. I'll put it in the show notes. I'll link to that episode. But yeah, like the 7th generation company of like the people who took the Native American concept of like, you know, whatever choices you make sure that they have a positive impact on the next 7 generations. Yeah. So let's talk for a minute about waste, because one of the things that in writing Wild Habits and in writing the Upcycle Your Pea book, which has been a big part of where my brain's been in the last 6 months, or has it even been that long? I don't even think it's been that long. It's been one of the things that's
weird.
Right? Well, I think the other thing is like, you know, with urine therapy, a lot of people say like it increases your cognitive function. And I'm like, oh, I guess that's what happened, because I started to be able to read a lot about cellular biology and, you know, things that like before I really couldn't get into biochemistry or cell biology and at the level that I was then able to. And I also became hyper productive in terms of creating written. Yeah. I'm like, I will have written 3 books and for the most part in 2022. The big discovery, and it happened like this, like I was drawing pictures for the Upcycle Your Pea book back in July, because it's a graphic novel. And I started to like just try to help people think about what is waste and what are waste products. And so I started drawing like the picture of like food going into the compost bin and the compost going into the dirt and the dirt growing the plant, of like, people need to understand it this way, right? And then all of a sudden I was like, which makes a lot of sense for anyone who's understood, anyone who's studied like fecal implants and why they're like storming the planet, because 1 out of 3 people has SIBO. So 1 out of 3 people like is not absorbing nutrition anyway, right? So their system has, you know, more or less leaky gut, right? Where they have an autoimmune, they're having an immune response, which eventually becomes an autoimmune response to eating, right? So big problem, right? So, and in case, I was like, well, what's the water cycle? You know, and then I'm getting into pee. I'm like, how do we drop? Because one of the big questions in pee is like, well, if it's okay for you, then why is it a waste product? Why do we pee it out? And it's like, well, cycles work that they're in cycle, like the water that is absorbed from the ocean into the clouds, and then it rains or snows, and then the mountains get replenished and it turns into little streams, which turn into rivers, which empty back into oceans. And then the whole thing happens again. And really where I landed from that, and actually I was having this conversation with my dear Ayurvedic friends today. And one of them was asking like, well, what about like, this is going to be TMI for most people, so turn it off for a minute if you can't handle it. But like, what happens with menstrual blood? And I was like, well, think about it. Like, a lot of people are using menstrual blood to fertilize plants. And it's like, well, why? Because it's so high in iron and it's so high in all these minerals. And it's like, what is not regenerative? Like, if we really understand biology, and we really, like the Chinese, when I was studying Chinese energy policy and living in Beijing, and, you know, just the whole thing of like how they were using human waste as fertilizer, because they were, you know, they have a well-developed system for doing that. And like most Americans are just, my guess is Australians too, are just appalled that like human waste could be used to grow food. And it's like, what happens when we don't? Right? Like, what happens when we don't? What happens when we put all of these sterilizing chemicals into our water supply and into our septic supply? I mean, it's just sort of absolutely insane. So I love your take on what is, because I've kind of come to the place of like, I don't know what waste is anymore. I know what toxicity is in the body. Like that's AMA, that's something that's not digested, that needs to be digested so it can be turned into something that's regenerative, which we might call waste on the way out, but it's like an output for a system that's getting ready to be upcycled, as far as I can tell, a definition of waste.
Yeah, I love that. I think if you're truly thinking in a systems thinking level, you can't find waste.
You can't find waste.
You shouldn't be able to find waste, because nature doesn't have waste. Like it doesn't go anywhere from this planet, you know. Like, nature didn't have a system to just like chuck the waste out into space, which by the way is like what we're thinking of doing. Like, let's not go there. It's mental, right? Like, and that's because we're in a degenerative system.
Yeah.
And it's not just like that we're you can't ever not be in a system because life is systems. So we're just not in a regenerative one at the moment. We're in a degenerative system. And at the moment, people are talking about like, well, how do we even
Degenerative
do
healthcare system,
sustainability?
degenerative building system, list them off. Like
Everything.
degenerative
Everything.
agriculture.
Yeah, even the thing with
Degenerative
agriculture.
medicine. I mean,
All of it. It's crazy. And I think
degenerative education. I mean, it's just.
Yeah. I mean, the toxicity thing is big because like it's, the plastics, the chemicals, the things like that, it's usually because we've taken something natural out of the system and then we've gone, oh, something's not happening the way that it should be. We need to add this other stuff, particularly in agriculture where like, we take away the things that eat the bugs or we take away the things that replenish the soil. And then we have to create this chemical replacement to do that. And then lo and behold, the soil doesn't absorb water anymore. We get like huge floods and wash off, and then there's no water in the basins underneath, and like huge systemic problems because we've just not been able to realize that the cycle is really important. The crazy thing though, like I love that you brought up the idea of like, we can't stand the idea of food being grown in human waste. And like, in Australia, they're really adverse even to the idea of recycling the water in the home. So, recycling from the toilets, being able to flush what's just, like water out onto the garden, or being able to recycle like your shower water in the laundry and then bring it through the toilet, like that is still so.
Like this is Christian era thinking. Like this only goes back 2000 years, first of all. So it's not that old, but it's still dominant, and it has a lot to do with disgust, and disgust is a culturally trained emotion. So like once we get all that, it's like, how much have you been indoctrinated into a system of disgust that actually it's not based in nature, it's based in pathological human culture.
Yeah,
sorry,
exactly.
Just had to throw that in.
No, totally. But most people who are shocked or disgusted by these things, like those systems in particular, would be like, they don't even think about what the astronauts are doing up in their closed loop system.
Oh yeah.
And it's like, what do you think they're drinking?
Yeah.
Where do you think the waste is going?
God, I watched a bunch of those videos on it, and it was really disappointing because like what they wanted, oh gosh, it was such a weird thing. It was like they wanted people to think that it wasn't that. It was so bizarre. It was like, it's not really pee, it's really,
we've done all of this stuff to it.
We've done all of this stuff to it. And I was like, well, they should also maybe just have a shot of pee, because then they wouldn't have to take all those supplements.
Once in a while.
Right? Then you'd like upcycle their the thinking is so sterile. The thinking is so man dominates nature. It's not a cooperative, holistic perspective.
But like the ability for us to lose control at this point, which requires like a level of, actually, can I step back and let the system do its own thing rather than me having to like micromanage the system? Like we're not trained for that. It's been trained out of us. As you say, it's like a cultural, like we're disgusted, or we think it's wild, and that wild is a bad thing. And like, oh, that needs to be over there. It's chaos. We need to control it. And it's
full of germs.
We need to let go of that.
Not sterile. Get out the alcohol. Get out the Purell.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
So tell me this. So you're in yoga health coaching, and what are you doing with it? Like, what are you in terms of like how, because I'm just, and I don't mean that in a way that like, I don't say that with any preconceived ideas of what you should be doing with it, because what I have seen from the business model of like leading a transformational journey is that it really is up to the leader to decide what and how to, like, what is the transformation and what is the journey, and how, and it can be so many different things, right? Given the leader. So I'm super just curious of like, what are you doing?
Yeah, what are we doing? So our 4 seasons, they build on top of each other, and we start with the habits, because it's kind of like, we're going to spend a whole year learning about how to think in a living systems context. And to start, we'll start with ourselves, because it's the easiest way to start. And also, you guys have got big dreams. You're all change makers. You need to be keeping this body in check so that you can have the energy to do the stuff that you want to do in the world, because like we need you out there. Like, don't quit your day job. You are needed.
So you're serving the people in the regenerative sector, like whether it's in building or energy or ag. Okay. Awesome.
Predominantly, yeah. And people who've come from like a permaculture design background, like anyone who's sort of interested in that way of like community building through the environment effectively. Sustainability consultants as well, I've got a few. So, and then we go from that, and then we take like a design perspective in the next season. So we'll still build on the habits, like a reminder, how's everybody doing? But then the next season is about design. And then after that, we go into leadership. And then after that, we go into Dharma. So like, how do you wrap it all together and go out and do the thing? Because you need to be in the world doing the thing.
That sounds so spot on. I mean, and really, I mean, what I get to too is like, that's the experience that only you could lead. And that's how I know it's resonant, or it's like, this so matches up with your past and your future in your present. Sweet.
Yeah.
So any advice to people who are considering yoga health coaching and you're kind of like you, where you're like, I wasn't a yoga teacher type, like that wasn't my background. And yet, wow, now you have a business model that works.
Yeah. Well, it really took a while for it to land. And it was the long-term thinking, I think, for me, of like, I know that there's something here, like, and this community that you have sort of created and continues to create itself now had something that I was like, there's something in this that I love and I want to be able to help propagate. So it was like, am I drawn to it? Yes. Is it like alive in its own way? Yes. Could I find a way for it to be alive for me? Yes. That takes time. And allowing myself to like be in the time of like being in this community for a few years and listening in and being like, how does that apply to different ways of thinking, different aspects of my life? But it needed to be unique to me. So I suppose it's like, don't come in with a preconceived idea of what it needs to look like. If you're not a yoga teacher, don't try and be a yoga teacher. Be what you are. And like, because you're needed in your community to serve your community, not the other community. So it's like, how do you take that and help it propagate in your own community in the way that only you can do, as you said? And that's regenerative, is like, what is the essence of you and how can you help that essence propagate?
Yeah, I'm so happy to hear it, and I can't wait to see where you go with it.
Yeah, it's been awesome. So thank you.
Yay, good. So everyone, this has been Jaime Hogan of, tell everyone I love your name of your website. It's like that, it's just so you, this Place Philosophy. So placephilosophy.com.au. How did you land on Place Philosophy? I mean, to me, it makes perfect sense, but I know it's a process.
It was kind of because I suppose place in the built environment professions is a very specific idea. So it like captures the attention of the people that I was trying to bring in. But also the philosophy is like, there's actually something more philosophical about what we should be doing and how we should be relating to place. And like, also the philosophy of like how we as people are relating to each other as well, and how we're actually framing the role of place in our lives and as a regenerative like source of, you know, life, and in the future, what do we want this place to be, which really effectively has to be philosophical. So it was kind of like, how do we bring those two together? Easy.
Awesome.
Place philosophy.
Awesome. So glad that you really, figured out how to make the yoga health coaching business model yours and generate your program within. Yeah. Super powerful.
Thanks. Right. Awesome.